So what we find is that there is an inevitable inter-inclusivity in the different kinds of commandments. So as we know already, we have said that Mishpatim are to some extent chukim, because the essence of the chok is that it is only fulfilled because it is the command of God. And this too is at the essence of the mishpat. And so we need to be reminded, and yet it is certainly true, that we must also fulfill the mishpat because it is divine will. And indeed, we have discovered that since it is God who has created the world and created the human mind, that indeed its aspect of being logical is nothing more than the form in which our minds were created. Now it seems to be irrefutable in our current state of having this power of logic. But we see right away that the mishpat includes the aspect of chok as well. So here you have your first example of inclusivity. What about the chukim? The chukim also have an element of interclusivity. First of all, there's no commandment which is only a commandment, which from the commandment we'd say, oh, do this. Commandments have details. So to go back to the Mishpatim, very often the general character of the mishpat, of the precept, is totally understandable and comprehensible and utilitarian, but there may be details which are clearly something which is a function of the Torah says it that way. We wouldn't necessarily do it that way. Indeed, in the opening words of the Parsha, Asher tasim lefnehem, you should place before them, one of the explanations that Rashi gives is that even if there is a mishpat for which non-Jewish courts have a similar law as the Jewish ones, we should always bring our disputes to Jewish courts. But the reality is that there are many areas of law, even in the area of civil law, which the Torah's teaching of it is perfectly logical, but differs from the non-Jewish teaching of those civil laws. So this is where you see this divine aspect. But the chukim as well, in general, the reason for the chok may be something which transcends logic. But on the other hand, the way the chok is implemented may make sense. And there we can see the aspect of mishpat within the aspect of chok. But what is more, and this is really a very inspiring dimension of the chukim, Maimonides himself in the Mishnah Torah emphasizes first and foremost that we keep all the commandments because they are divine decree. But then says they also contain profound lessons which are comprehensible to us and applicable in our lives, and urges that whenever it is possible for us to derive a moral, ethical lesson, that we should do so. And hence, we see from the chok, we can also have this aspect of mishpat. Just to take it one step further, the edot, the testimonies, clearly represent a hybrid of the two aspects, because the idea of commemorating something is something which is logical. We would not necessarily say, look, God rested on the seventh day, we also have to rest on the seventh day. And yet, once His commandment is given to us, it makes perfect sense. It also obviously contains the aspect of chok, because of the fact it is something that we would not have on our own initiative commanded in that way. Furthermore, to give the classic edut as an example, the Shabbat absolutely embodies the idea that it's absolutely logical to rest on Shabbat, but the activities which the Torah defines as work do not fit neatly into human intellect. And we know that there are things which are not at all strenuous, and yet they are forbidden on Shabbat. There are activities that do make one tired, and they are allowed on Shabbat. God, of course, is infinite. When He rested, it was not in order to get over being tired. And this aspect is reflected in our keeping of Shabbat. So, to conclude, all of the all of the categories of commandments, in a sense, have within them the other categories. So there is a kind of inter-inclusivity. And now let's go straight to what actually is the title in the textbook. I'm digressing, taking some liberties with it to go a step deeper. There is, in fact, a beautiful lesson to be learned from something which is otherwise clearly a chok, milk and meat. The verse says that thou shalt not cook a kid in its mother's milk. In a very fundamental Rashi, and of course, whenever we say Rashi, we're really saying the halakhic sections of Talmud and Midrash, which Rashi synthesizes, and yet it is in many ways, of course, a work of genius because he has to pick from this vast literature the ones that fit closest to the simple meaning of the verse. So first thing that Rashi explains is a kid does not mean to be a goat. He gives a very convincing grammatic proof, which is in other places, indeed most places in the Torah. Kid, gedi, is then qualified by another word. Sometimes it says a kid goat, sometimes it says a kid sheep, and so on. And therefore Rashi understands from this that when the word kid, gedi, is stated without any modifier, it can mean any young animal. In case anyone was interested in why we say a kid is not only a goat. Furthermore, what's even more interesting, leitiv ashel, we shall not cook it. What exactly does that mean? Later in the book of Shemot, we have an exact repetition of the same verse. And the third time in the Torah, the prohibition of milk and meat is again repeated in a slightly different phraseology, but always it is about not being cooked. And we know that nothing in the Torah is superfluous. And on the other hand, most prohibitions, the most simple level of prohibition is not to eat something. That is most of the prohibitions. There are certain other ones which go beyond that and add the prohibition of getting benefit from them. For example, chametz. It is not prohibited merely to eat it, but we cannot sell it during the holiday of Pesach and so on. And so clearly, it's intuitive. We're not being told, "Oh, do anything you want with milk and meat, just don't cook it." It's even not to cook it, and this is beyond the categorization of eating, and also beyond the categorization of having benefit from it. And so, indeed, as Rashi explains, there are 3 prohibitions of milk and meat, each one being understood from a different repetition of the verse the 3 times. We are not allowed to eat milk and meat together. We are not allowed to have derived benefit from it together, which on a very simple level means you can't feed it to animals, for example. So there are dog foods which contain beef and milk. They should not be used. Practical point. And we can't even cook it together, even in an instance where we would not benefit or eat it. This prohibition applies when there is heat. Primarily, the so-called, what is called the kashrut contamination process happens when things are hot. Otherwise, a layer can be cut away, or some small amount can be disposed of. But the full prohibition of their intermixing happens where there's heat. And so the Talmud raises an interesting question: what happens when there is the milk or the cheese is hot and the meat is not, and the other way around? And what happens if hot cheese falls on cold meat, or the opposite? And there is a machloket, a dispute between the Talmudic sages Rav and Shmuel. If we say that the lower one is predominant, and hence if the lower one is hot and the higher one is cold, then there is a full-fledged prohibition here. They both need to be thrown away, or the other way around, if it's in fact the higher one that dominates. And in fact, the halacha is, according to Shmuel in this case, called tatagavar, which is that it is the lower one that determines whether or not there was sufficient heat to create this contamination, or treifing, as we say in Yiddish. And so if the bottom one is hot, everything gets thrown away. If the bottom one is cold, there's a variety of options called klifa, for example, where you only one layer becomes prohibited. And in addition, however, we know that we wait, but we wait a long time after meat because of digestion. Others say because of the particles between the teeth that take a very long time to be removed. But after milk, it's a relatively short wait. And so there's a wonderful Kabbalistic explanation of this, which is a profound lesson in life as well. And I'm going to tell it to you at the very beginning of the next clip.